To get started, we're doing something pretty interesting here. I think all of you have seen these devices on your chairs. We're basically going to walk you through a couple scenarios, and we want to hear what your response would be in each of these. Basically difficult situations that a lot of the folks on this panel have faced themselves. You'll see some possible choices you can make. Again, under your chair there's a device where you can pick the answer that comes closest to how you would respond. These are real situations, but they're not exact. We're just trying to put you basically in the decision maker's seat here. So let's go to the first scenario if you have that gadget with you. You're a YouTube executive, and you learn that a government in Central Asia has cut off YouTube for its citizens. The government says that the site is down because of a handful of videos that it says insults the country's president, something prohibited under national law. The videos do not violate YouTube's content guidelines. So what do? I'm going to give you 4 different responses, and you pick either 1, 2, 3, or 4 on that device. You can pull down the videos. 2, you could speak to the government and remove the most controversial videos. 3, you could use technology to restrict people in the country from seeing the videos while keeping them accessible to citizens elsewhere. Or 4, you leave the videos up, knowing that YouTube may be blocked indefinitely by the government. So if you would just go ahead and make a decision now. 1, 2, 3, or 4. Okay.
Wow.
Mm-hmm. So it looks like overwhelmingly, yeah. Leave the videos up knowing that YouTube may be blocked indefinitely by the government. You know, David, you did face this type of situation with videos that proved controversial in the Muslim world. What did you do? Tell us about what you did in that situation.
Yeah, well,
you came to your
yeah, I'll get to that in a second, but
you want to talk about
mind commenting on the result here. This is an interesting result that 4 got the majority. It turns out what you asked was a bit of a trick question. So, because the answer to what YouTube would actually do is actually not in the, not listed there. It turns out there are a couple subtleties. These things seem simple, but there are a couple subtleties. First of all, you have to ask yourself, is YouTube even launched? Do we even consider ourselves subject to what the government of the Central Asian Republic even wants us to do? And it turns out that there are countries where we target the country with content in the local language and with local content and so forth, and that's where we think, okay, we need to start thinking about what their laws are. If we haven't done that, we generally don't really respond to any because we don't think any one government that we have no connection with should be able to say to reach across the world and say and tell us to take content down or not. Now the second subtlety is that we actually don't like. 3 is something that we had to do sometimes when we have people on the ground. We're launched in the country. If we don't take it down, or we could get people arrested and so forth. So we have in the past blocked videos, so they're not accessible in that country, but accessible to people everywhere else. We don't like that either, because that feels like what you're saying to someone in that country is, the analogy would be, there might be something illegal in your country, but you can go travel outside your country and do it, right, if it's legal there, and it's up to your government to stop you, right, from traveling. We think the same should be true on the internet at a minimum, such that you should be, so what we do is we have a country sort of version, as I said before, a local version, and then within that, if we look at the complaint from the government, we think it's legitimate, they've followed we've made them jump through all the hoops of legal process and so forth, and we're advised that it's illegal, we'll think about removing it from the local version, but the user can flip out of the local version and go to a global version, a US version, and still see the content. We think that's the right way to try to balance against sort of some legitimate view of the government to regulate things according to how they see it in their country, and free speech. Now, there was also the third subtlety. There's a hint in the question that might lead me, although 3.5 would be that answer, right? Which would be to say, block it from the local version, but let the user change the default and go to a global version. That's 3.5. Now, there's a hint in the question that might lead me to go to 4, nonetheless, which is that the law was about criticizing the president. And so you think about that and you say, well, wait a minute, that's just somebody, is it a law that's been around for 100 years and it's been sort of the people accept it? You can't criticize Kemal Ataturk in Turkey, right? So that's something that's been around for a long, long time. Or is it something that some president just launched when they got into office 2 years ago? And in the latter, I might be inclined to say, no, we're not going to cooperate with any kind of political censorship. And if it means YouTube's blocked, so be it.
Norm, does the size of the country matter, or the sort of economic potential that it represents matter in any way when you're dealing with a situation like this?
I don't think the size can matter, but I do think that practically if you have employees in a country and you think that their lives or livelihood is at stake, it may govern your behavior. But I think that may mean getting them out of the country rather than adhering to practices that are inconsistent with what you need to do to be consistent with your business. I have a fairly simple rule that is, I sometimes just ask myself about laws that we have in the United States that we adhere to and how someone from outside the U.S. might feel about some of the either permissions or restrictions that we allow. And in general, I think that there are, I don't like the idea of being in a position where we have decided that we're going to violate any country's law. I would rather pull out and not do business there if that's the choice that we're confronted with. If we find a law that we're just not very comfortable with.
I think in a situation like this, where would you?
I would come out closer to 3 than to 4, but it would, as David suggests, there are a lot of variations on each one of these that might very well go for a contrary decision. To take Turkey as an example, there are lots of places where free speech is permissible within Turkey, but if you suggest that the treatment of Armenians was genocide under what's called Rule 301, I think it's called, that in itself can get, you not only shut down, but get your staff incarcerated. So, do you adhere to that, but then, other parts of their code you don't? I mean, those are the kinds of things where I think consistency for a corporation is pretty important.
Mm-hmm. One thing that this multiple choice test doesn't really enter into is the question of what exactly is the information that you're falling on your sword for. If it's a law to protect the good graces of the president, that's one thing. But in the actual case that YouTube was dealing with, it was anybody who's seen it can tell you a genuinely offensive, not just allegedly offensive, assault on the Prophet Muhammad. And one thing that I'm not a Muslim, but one thing that enters into your thinking here: what are the consequences of going ahead, not just for Google and YouTube, but of allowing this to be widely distributed? And we know that there was the potential for people to be killed in the ensuing public reaction to the videos. So that doesn't necessarily answer the question, but it's got to be a factor you take into account when you make a very, very tricky cost-benefit analysis.
Well, I'll just follow up on that. I was actually in the middle of a situation like that at Newsweek, and this is already about 10 years ago, when as a result of a little item that we published in the front of the magazine about allegations of desecration of the Koran at Guantanamo Bay, that guards were kind of, tormenting the prisoners by doing, things to the Koran. When that got, just news of that little item was picked up in the Arab world, it set off a week of riots. Dozens of people were killed. I mean, it's one thing to have to confront, and it's not a reason necessarily not to publish, but it's another factor that you have to take into account. It's not just laws, it's just not being, commercial interests, but sometimes, particularly in these issues of offense to other cultures and religions, particularly in that area of the world, you can actually set off, a lot of violence and, a grave international, incident.
Mark, had you anticipated that reaction?
Not at all. I mean, and we've now seen it a number of times. With this latest video was the latest example last year. But we actually took great pains to check that item, and there were some things. Ultimately, the source of that item retracted, and we had other problems as a result of that. But the idea that it might set off riots is something at the time that never occurred to us.
I think it's worth keeping in mind that there are some real penalties in a way for adhering to that censorship too. If you decide you're going to have a flexible rule where every jurisdiction can impose a restriction on you, then you have no common standards at all, and that in itself, I think, can create real problems for you.
We were talking about the lives that are at stake, and this next scenario is very interesting because it deals with exactly that. So again, if everybody could take out their device, we want to hear what you would do here. In the second scenario, you are the top editor of a major US newspaper. You get an email from a blogger who says she has hundreds of Pentagon emails that outline a plan for a preemptive strike against North Korea. The emails are authentic, but contain classified material that would threaten our troops. The blogger says she will not publish the emails in full if your paper exposes the plan. What do? 1, tell the blogger to take her emails to someone else. 2, publish the stories and email excerpts, but only after consulting the Defense Department. 3, publish the stories and emails, but leave out the most sensitive information. Or 4, publish the stories and provide online links to the full text of all the emails. So if you would just take a moment and answer that one. Great. Okay, so it looks like most of you went with publish the stories and email excerpts, but only after consulting the Defense Department. Bill, what's your reaction?
Why could you possibly be calling on me on this one? Yes, this bears a resemblance to a certain leak that took place back in 2010. And so I can tell you what we did in that case. I mean, you ask yourself a series of questions. The first obvious one is this information true? Because news organizations have been punked by fabrications over the years. And there are a number of ways you can do that. You can go ask the government, are these your emails? You can ask sources within the government. You can ask experts without the government. In our case, there was very little question that the WikiLeaks documents were authentic once several of our reporters who'd seen a fair number of classified cables had read them. The next question you ask is this of value? It may be that the information has no great news value or public interest value. In the case of the WikiLeaks documents, we knew right from the outset that they were of considerable value, just supplying texture and a real sense of what was going on the ground in 2 wars, and a lot of specific bits of information about what the U.S. government was up to in its operations around the world. So we passed that threshold. And then the third question you ask is, are there, what consequences could arise from this that would make you want to hesitate to publish them? And in this case, the main consequence that concerned us was that these cables identified quite a number of innocent informants, human rights activists, dissidents, ordinary Afghan and Iraqi villagers who had answered questions when the military came and asked them things. And we were concerned that those people could be hurt or killed if their names were published. So we determined early on that we would redact the documents in that respect. And then, of course, we did, because as a matter of course, when we have information about a person or institution, we go to them for comment. We did go to the Pentagon with the first 2 tranches of WikiLeaks documents, and then the State Department with the third, and gave them a chance to try to make the case that some of these things, beyond just the redacting of informants, should be withheld. In very few instances did they make that case. But another reason you do that, of course, is you want some context, and we did get some useful context by bouncing various stories off the officials involved. So, I mean, what real life is not a multiple choice question. So the actual answer would probably be 5, none of the above. But some combination of 2 and 3 is what we actually did, I guess, in the WikiLeaks case.
Go ahead.
So, well, it's, I think that there is a possible distinction between the hypothetical and what Bill experienced with WikiLeaks, in that if you're talking about an imminent attack on a country, you might be subject to the Espionage Act, which raises a whole bunch of other questions that go beyond issues of free speech.
Sure. I mean, it wasn't clear from the question whether this was an actual plan that they intended to carry out or a contingency
that's
plan.
right.
The Pentagon has a contingency plan for everything.
Exactly. So I'm saying but I'm just saying that would be at least another hurdle I'd want to get past. Was, if you will, what laws are we going to challenge or violate here? Is this a Pentagon paper situation where they're trying to, you have a prior restraint question. Is this an Espionage Act question? So I'd want to get past that.
So in trying to get past that, what would your parameters be?
I'd probably go do exactly what Bill did.
The other thing, Trish, that I mean, I think isn't captured necessarily in the sort of these sort of flat hypotheticals, is that often on the other side sometimes you're dealing with people who are either trying to completely shut you down and kind of there's no wiggle room. But often, particularly when you're dealing with a government, they're pretty sophisticated. They know that the press is not necessarily going to go away or going to buckle if they don't want a story published. So often you end up in a sort of a negotiation. I mean, I remember once, again, back in my Newsweek days, when we published a story which at the time turns out that this was a much bigger story than we even understood, on the use of drones in Afghanistan. And it was when we were first really discovering that drones were being used. And we went to the Pentagon for comment, and it was clear that they didn't want any part of this story, but I think it was also clear that they knew that we were going to go ahead and publish it. But what they wanted was that we not disclose the locations from which the drones were being launched. And we sort of took that under advisement and decided that that actually was reasonable. It didn't necessarily undercut the story. That really wasn't the story was about. The story was about the use of the technology. And so we decided to publish on that basis. So I think sometimes the outcome of this depends not just on you're trying to find, the responsible thing for you to do, but whether you're dealing with a party on the other side that also, is grown up about it.
So is there a sense that you have to be respectful and cognizant of national security issues then?
No, absolutely. And I think one of the things that's, it's interesting because probably, although it's interesting here that there's everybody defaulted to at least, consult the Pentagon. So it's not a sort of, publish whatever you want crowd. But, in public opinion, I think all of us who have been through this know that actually overall public opinion is actually against the press.
Favor of secrecy.
In favor of secrecy, particularly when it comes to government and national security issues. And I think a lot of people who take a dim view of the press because we think that we go ahead and publish anything without regard to the consequences don't understand that there are many cases where we not necessarily don't publish or don't air something, but where we do actually agree not to publish or air certain things, particularly on national security grounds.
Of course, those don't get as much attention because they don't know what you don't publish.
Yes, exactly.
Right. I was just going to say that there's an interesting thread that links the two scenarios in terms of the protection of people on the ground that Bill mentioned that really drove a lot of what they did in terms of redacted material. In the Innocence of Muslims video, it turned out that we actually blocked the video in Egypt and in Libya temporarily because it was a fast-moving situation. We didn't know what was going on. There was a concern that the video was indeed causing violence and causing loss of life. And so we did actually block it in those countries temporarily, and then when we thought the danger was past, we put it back up. So that's a driving issue here.
Yeah. Again, protecting lives.
Protecting lives, yeah.
The technology to block those videos, people can't, what if it's on someone's Facebook page downloaded from another country? I mean, can you really and truly limit people's access.
Yeah, I mean, the governments understand that, and that's why they go for the choke points, right, on the internet. So they figure most people are going to look at the video through YouTube. Sure, the video's been downloaded, been sent around via email, through posts on Facebook pages, right? So it's all over the place. But they figure we'll do what we can, and usually what they can means let's go to Google, or let's go to Facebook, or let's go to YouTube, or let's go to Twitter, places that lots and lots of people use. But you're right, it's impossible to, once something is out there on the open web, it is literally impossible, lest you do what Egypt did in the wake of their spring and just try to shut the entire internet down for a country.
That's a really important sort of uber point too, because there is a dynamic behind free expression, and there's a sort of irony that the title of this is Can Free Expression Survive in the Internet Age? I think the internet, which has its pluses and minuses, is an incredible asset to freedom of expression because, for exactly that reason, it gives people the tools to elude censorship.
You've all had and still have remarkable careers and have been around journalism for decades. When you think back over that span of time, can you think of a situation that really weighed on you, that was a difficult decision to make, that may be akin to some of the things that we're talking about here today? Mark?
Well, I think as an executive, who, charged with, the safety and well-being of a staff, I think the things that really weigh on you have to do with your own people as much as with these abstract issues of, free speech and censorship. And certainly, I think for me, it's always been, that's kind of number one. Mm-hmm. And then, number two are the issues of, the public's right to know and so forth. And number three really are the commercial interests. And again, I think there's this kind of common assumption that somehow that's the first thing that we all think about, in these situations is how is it going to harm our business? But the fact is, even with all the challenges that journalism faces, in terms of, economically, in terms of the business model, that usually, you get around to it, but that's not number one. And often what you're doing is, informing the people on the business side or, your parent company or your owner, just so that they know, but making a strong recommendation based on, the first two factors, which is what do you think the right thing to do journalistically, and also what is the thing that you have to do, or that, how does the well-being of your staff weigh into it?
You have to protect people. I mean, can you talk at all about what happened in China and the need to protect employees there? And I'm sure all that went through your head.
Well, Bloomberg has been banned in China since last summer for reasons that are somewhat related to censorship. We have, for the most part, not printed bylines on stories coming out of China, because there were restrictions on our ability to treat our Chinese staff as journalists. And so if we had to distinguish between our Chinese and non-Chinese staff, we just wouldn't byline those stories. With regard to the censorship, it was very clear to us that if we chose to publish the story that we did on the assets of the incoming president's extended family, that we would be banned. And I think it was equally clear to us that if we didn't print the story, that would really jeopardize our credibility as a news organization. And so it was not a close call, really.
Yeah. We had an almost identical situation and a very similar story, the one that David Barboza just got the Pulitzer for a couple of weeks ago. Again, the wealth of the highly placed in China, and we have just recently launched a Mandarin language website in China, and they shut it down. The Mandarin language one shut it down promptly, and have not shown any inclination to let us resume it. But I think, and that will cost us some money if they stretch it out long enough. They can make life miserable for you. But I think, just to sort of reinforce what Norm said, your credibility as a news organization is not only at stake here and in the sort of Western world, but within China. And a lot of Chinese know that Bloomberg and the Times had taken a serious economic hit for publishing stories that their government didn't want. And in the long run, I think that is, so to speak, good for our brand. That buys us credibility in China.
But that's assuming that they let you back in. So in other words, as you weigh all these decisions, I think clearly you want to do what's in the best interest of your people, what's in the best interest of journalism. But as an organization that's trying to make money, does a market like China cause anyone to say, okay, we want to be there, we want to have a presence, it's a huge opportunity. How do we balance this with our own ideals and our own sense of what's right? You want to?
Well, sure, yeah. I mean, I was going to, not to keep talking about China, but in terms of agonizing decisions, our decision to basically not pull out of China, which some people refer to it as, but to move our search engine to Hong Kong essentially, and not be behind the Chinese firewall, which required us to do the self-censorship, was agonizing because we had made the opposite decision a few years before, right? We'd been avoiding going to China, and we decided, well, look, we want to be there, we want to be on the ground, we're going to have a big presence there, we're going to be behind the firewall, and we're going to try to manage this censorship problem. And we thought things might get better, right? We had people on the ground who were, we thought that as we delivered more of our services, there might open up, we might see more web activity, the government might understand that this is good for the country. That turned out not to be the case. And so when we got the hacking incident and it was clear that it was politically motivated, it was attacking our users, some of whom, I had to go visit a sophomore student at Stanford whose parents were from Tibet. She was born in India, going to school at Stanford, had been part of Students for a Free Tibet. Her email account was hacked into by someone from China, right? And I had to go tell her this and talk to her about it. And it became clear that we weren't getting anywhere. So it was an agonizing decision because, in part, obviously because we came to a point where we didn't feel this being there matched our ideals, but it was also because we had made an investment to try to be there with the sort of the constructive engagement approach. And we had lots of folks on the ground who had, Chinese nationals who were committed to that strategy, right? And who had risked things, right? To be associated with Google, to be part of Google in our efforts. And so when we had to change course, that had a lot of implications, not just for Google and our business going forward in China, but for individuals, who were there and for working for us.
I think it's important to make clear that China is not the only place that has laws that restrict the ability of the press to do things we'd like to do. In the U.S., I think there's a very serious question that all of us have faced in one form or another about what kind of protections you give to a confidential source in the face of efforts either by prosecutors or plaintiffs or defendants in civil cases to try to get information from your source, and what are your obligations to journalism, to protecting your sources, and to trying to follow law.
I'm sure we've all spent far more time than we would have liked to in our careers just dealing with British libel laws. So you think of Britain as being kind of, a long-standing democracy and so forth, but you have to sort of scrub things that you publish about things that are going on with Britain, with a very different comb than you do here because of their laws, and that's just, it's accepted, and we all do that. So it's not just repressive. I mean, somebody made this point earlier. It's not just, authoritarian regimes that are kind of, capriciously and arbitrarily trying to impose censorship, but often you're dealing with highly evolved legal systems that, have very different standards than we do.
In terms of what you were saying with protecting sources, you think about journalists and ultimately, I mean, that is our responsibility to protect our sources. Just as a doctor wants to treat every patient, journalists want to protect their sources. It's kind of just an instinct, I think, that goes along with what one does. But how do you, I think you bring up a very interesting point. So when you have the law saying, no, you need to divulge this information, or maybe it's a national security issue, how do you navigate that? And have you had a specific incident with a journalist
Yes.
that
I wrote a book about it.
Yes, as a matter of fact, I have. when I was editor-in-chief of Time Inc., we were subpoenaed by a special prosecutor for a grand jury investigation, and there was an existing law, case law from the Supreme Court that said that when it comes to a grand jury, you don't have any rights to keep sources confidential, that since grand juries are supposed to be confidential themselves, the court had ruled in a case called Brandsburg in the early 70s that you had no protection in those circumstances. We took that case up to the Supreme Court, as did the New York Times. We lost on our cert petition, or the cert petition was not granted. I chose to turn over our notes to the special prosecutor. New York Times reporter, the Times itself wasn't named, where in Time Inc. we were, but the reporter, Judith Miller at the Times, chose not to and went to jail. So those were two cases where, with somewhat different fact situations, we nonetheless came to different conclusions about what to do.
It's been, well, I was just going to say that, I mean, we all come from most of us come from the press side of things. The most frequent line of attack against breaches of government secrecy is, of course, to go after the leakers, which this administration has been much more aggressive about than predecessors. There have been 6 cases, criminal cases brought under the Espionage Act against leakers, which is more, I think, than all previous administrations put together. Some of the, there's a lot of speculation about how much of that is Democrats having to prove they're, more Catholic than the Pope when it comes to national security. I think probably the biggest reason for this is, in fact, that we're in the digital age, and every leaker leaves footprints all over the place. That's how they got, for example, John Kiriakou. That's how they got Bradley Manning, the WikiLeaks private.
I think a big change that's going on, though, is the question of who is a journalist in the digital age. An awful lot of the case law has been made with, more recently at least, with rather large established publications, but increasingly, whether it's cases in the United States or certainly cases around the world involving press freedom, it's very much about lonely bloggers without big news organizations behind them. I'm on the board of committee to protect journalists, and certainly the vast majority of of the cases that we get involved in these days are not with established news organizations, but with independent journalists who are working without the benefit of that kind of corporate protection.
The other thing, and it's not just the internet. I mean, it's it was taken to another level with the internet, and I think it's sort of been taken exponentially to an even higher, much higher level by social media. And another implication of that is the ways in which people with access to their own publishing platforms now, everybody is not only a journalist but a publisher, can actually disrupt the chain of reporting and decision making being made by big media organizations. So you may be going through all of the kind of deliberative processes that we've been talking about here, deciding what to air, what not to air, what to publish, what not to publish, going through negotiations, dealing with your sources, dealing with your staff, and then all of a sudden one tweet
shows up, yeah.
By somebody who overheard your reporter talking to somebody else, or some disgruntled employee who's tweeting about internal decision making and so forth, can disrupt the whole thing, and then you have to
So
reassess.
what's the danger of that?
Well, I mean, I think that, again, I think people who just basically believe that, this idea that you're better off just sort of putting everything out there these days and letting the system sort of, crowdsourcing, self-correct. I mean, that is now a philosophy that we all have to contend with. Look, I mean, I think the danger in terms of responsible, credible journalism that we're all trying to do is that either what you're doing or about to report or thinking about reporting gets misrepresented, or your hand gets forced and you have to sort of make a decision prematurely before you're really ready responsibly to make that decision. All kinds of assumptions. Then, as a result of a lot of this stuff on social media, then you get all kinds of pressure. Well, somebody tweets that you're working on a story. well, yeah, you're working on a story. Ordinarily, in the past, your response would be, look, we'll wait until it's ready, and then we'll either publish it, we'll not publish it. You can respond then. But now somebody tweets that, and there's this whole sort of barrage of incoming that you get about why are you sitting on this story? Why haven't you published it yet? Yeah. So look, it's reality. It's what we deal with, but it's a very different reality than I think all of us faced, even 20 years ago.
I think there's also one other thing, picking up on both what Mark and Bill said, is that email is really an interesting issue for all of us in terms of how do you protect it. That the leaks are very much a function of email, and one of the things we're increasingly finding is that the E in email might as well stand for evidence, because we really don't have the ability to control the ownership of it, and that's an issue that certainly you have to deal with as well.
But what Mark's talking about, just the fact that all this information can now come to the forefront, maybe before it's properly sourced, before it's properly checked out. Some of it's true, some of it's not true. Does Google have any responsibility? Do you feel as though you have responsibility there for if something is blatantly false, yet is making the rounds on the internet? How do you navigate that?
Yeah, I think our commitment is to be open and be the platform for lots and lots of things without making tons of judgments, curatorial judgments, right? Because we're not good at that. Having said that, I do think relevance is a really important value for us, right? That's why Google search works, is because people find it useful, because we try to give you the thing that's most relevant to your query. So when lots of things are breaking quickly and there's lots of things out there, we're trying to use, granted they're computers, they're not humans, but computers are getting pretty smart these days. We're trying to sift through that to give you the what's most relevant. Now there are a lot of signals we can use, and if it's a lone person, for instance the tweet the other day about the White House being bombed, and that caused the Dow to drop 200 points or whatever it was for 2 minutes. You can't game Google systems that way, right? There would need to be more signals for us to start really promoting the idea that that the White House has been bombed and so forth. So I think our algorithms will be actually pretty good at that. So we do try to. I think relevance is what we're trying to focus on, and if something seems completely isolated. So as a result, we might not get the thing. Sometimes we might not get the very first thing, right, when it first comes out, because our systems, in some ways, kind of like your editorial judgments, it takes a little while, at least some time, to figure out if it's true or if it's relevant enough to sort of surface. You can always get it at Google. The question is, where do you get it at Google? Do you get it toward the top? Do you get it, toward the bottom, where you want to see it?
But
can I just stick in an old media hack thought? I think the democratization of the media has changed a lot.
Yeah.
I would say on balance mostly for the good, some not for the good. But one thing that it has not changed very much is the kind of thing we're talking about today, the sort of deep story that draws on secret information and rocks capitals.
Right.
Those tend to come from not from the sort of lone blogger, but from people who have had time to develop sources and trust with sources. They don't, the Times toyed with the idea of after WikiLeaks of setting up a sort of, anonymous tip drop, email box, and a few other places talked about doing that, and the places that have tried it, I believe, have discovered nothing much comes in. Because most of those big stories, the rendition in stories, the torture stories, the NSA eavesdropping stories, come from, reporters that takes a lot of time. You have to cultivate your trust with sources. Nowadays, you have to find a way to communicate with them that's not electronic. Right. You don't have subpoenas. You don't have, search warrants. You don't have a lot of help, and that just doesn't lend itself apparently to the sort of lone blogger quite as readily as expressing an opinion or passing on a relatively less consequential piece of information.
Let me qualify that a little bit. First of all, I think that while traditional media companies certainly have resources to do a lot of big stories, it's worth remembering the First Amendment wasn't passed for big media companies. It was much more to protect the penny press, which is a whole lot closer to bloggers than it is to large news organizations. And I think for every story that a New York Times or Washington Post does, I think of Cy Hirsch doing My Lai as a freelancer, or of stories that are coming out of Iraq and Afghanistan every day from people who are blogging, some anonymously, but who are discussing things that none of us, no matter how big our news organization, can get close to. So while I think it's true that for the biggest stories that go to issues of national security, more often than not, those take a long time to do, or the toughest business stories. I think of the New York Times expose of Walmart in Mexico. That's not a story that could have been easily pulled together by an individual, but there's still an awful lot of stories that can embarrass a lot of entrenched interests that an individual seems to be able to get hold of. And the protections of the First Amendment, I think, have to extend far beyond just traditional news gatherers.
I totally agree.
I also think, certainly, when I was at CNN, that this may be changing now, but I think the focus of a lot of big media companies for a long time in terms of the internet and social media has been, okay, this is a new platform, we have to figure out how to publish or how to air on this new platform, or it's a marketing tool and we can kind of draw attention to our reporting. But I think it's also something we need to be reporting on, and not just on the technology and so forth and so on, but really monitoring it closely for stories and for, because, there are a lot of examples, particularly with the explosion of Facebook and Twitter, of stories that begin to bubble up on social media before a lot of traditional media have really noticed them. So, I think that's also something that I think, on the one hand, there are a lot of dangers in the kind of citizen, everybody's a journalist, but I think there are a lot of opportunities there, and I think one thing that's incumbent on us is to actually be taking the possibility that there are going to be big stories and even scoops that are going to come out of that, and to be watching for them.
Yeah, an opportunity, basically. Let me get to scenario 3. Again, if everybody could just get their device out. Here we go. You're a Western television news executive, and your reporter in China undercovers a corruption scandal involving a minister's son. The authorities refuse to comment and threaten to block your website and revoke your license to operate if you air the story. What do? Do you, 1, air the story regardless of consequence, 2, scrap the story, no single story is worth depriving Chinese citizens of your reports, 3, air the story on your global network and website, but use technical means to make sure it's not seen in China, or 4, enter into negotiations with the government to find a way to resolve your differences. And I may start with Norm on this one. 1, air the story regardless of consequence.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Look, I think you have to first ask yourself the question, is the story in the public interest? Is it a story that's of importance to your readers? If the public official is a postal clerk in Shenzhen, then it's not very important. If you're talking about a high-level public official where it's clearly in the public interest, I think you'd very definitely go ahead with the story. That seems like a pretty straightforward one. There are obvious consequences from it. It is important to keep in mind that we and China specifically come at the question of information very differently. I don't know if it's still the case, but in the years that I was spending a lot of time in China, the relevant ministry was the Ministry of State Information and Propaganda, and the two were really thought of as the same, that information belonged to the state, and so even publishing economic data could be perceived as violating the laws of China. And we obviously come at this from a very different place. That's why I don't expect that we're going to resolve our differences with China in the near future. But authoritarian regimes have been around for a long time. it wasn't that long ago that Korea, the Philippines, Malaysia, Singapore were thought of as places where you went to get censored. And at some point, I think, China's economic growth will lead to a level of political liberalization, but it's going to take a while.
How does a journalist, how do they navigate trying to do their job in an environment of an authoritarian regime? I'll give you an example myself recently. I was in touch with someone in Latin America who was in the rival camp. Basically, it was Maduro's team down in Venezuela, and well, the guy who was running against Maduro in Venezuela. And one of the things that I was told was, well, be very careful when you're trying to deal with Capriles. They're gonna watch all these emails. Why don't you just talk to so and so in Miami? Why don't you just do this on a cell phone? Don't call his campaign manager's cell phone because everything is being watched, and it's just not good for him, et cetera. So it just brings up the issue of how challenging I think it is for people when they're reporting on the ground in a country where everything is always constantly being watched, whether it's your cell phone calls, whether it's your email. What advice do Mark? Maybe you, because you've had reporters all over the world that deal with
I guess my first reaction is that's not anything new. I mean,
right.
We dealt with that in Watergate, right? I mean, Woodward and Bernstein were having to, take great pains because they thought they were, rightly so, that they were being, monitored by the Nixon administration. Look, I mean, I think that's just tradecraft. I wanted to say something though about the China example, which is just to reiterate that. I think Bill raised the point earlier about kind of the reputational damage that not publishing a story can bring, particularly if you're a media company. And this is where, if you just look at it from a business point of view, I think it does matter who your parent company is. Mm-hmm. Because if you're a pure newspaper or journalistic or organization, then I think there's very little question that the right thing to do journalistically ultimately is also the right thing to do for your business, right, because you don't want to compromise that. On the other hand, if you're, say, hypothetically, part of a media company that's part of a big, corporate conglomerate that's main business is making jet engines and plastics and so forth, then I'm not defending this, but you might ultimately, if you're the head of that corporation and the board of that corporation, wonder why you're putting up with the headache of having this media organization that keeps creating problems for your business.
That's actually a very,
which might be one reason that hypothetical big conglomerate doesn't actually own that
right,
tiny little media company.
Right. Very, 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 very good point.
But I do want to weigh in. Can I weigh in briefly on your point about the surveillance state?
Sure.
I mean, one of the things that you hear a lot of people talking about is the internet is these technologies allow for more expression and more people to use them and participate.
And more surveillance.
But they also allow for governments that know how to use them to surveil better. And it's something we grapple with at Google all the time. Because we feel there's a responsibility. We're putting these products out there for people, whether it's a blogging platform or a video platform or or an email service, and knowing that governments are actively trying to get into those services and sort them out and persecute people based on what they find it's a pretty big problem. So
what do you do about that?
We spend a lot of time on security. I mean, we think the best team in the business doing this. We spend millions and millions on developing ways to make sure that that you can get in, that only you can get into your accounts, and try to be as transparent with people as possible about lots of ways. We offer lots of ways for you to figure out what's going on with your account, which is a critical thing, right? If you don't know what's going on, you don't know who's tried to get into your account, then you're never going to know there's a problem. So lots of things like that, but it is a big problem.
I just want to mention to everyone, if you want to jump into the conversation, you have a comment or a question, technology is just great, right? Because you have these devices and there's a button on there that says microphone, and so you can maybe raise your hand and we'll go over to you, and you just press that button and speak into that device, and everyone will be able to hear you. So definitely, if you have a question or comment, please join in. So overall, I mean, it sounds as though everybody's saying, though, that it's positive. What's going on is this amazing transformation in how people get information. And it's no longer the traditional big news organizations anymore. Some of it's coming from the little folks and the bloggers and the Twitter accounts. It's just that there's the challenge of trying to sift through what's real, what's not real. I mean, is it ultimately better for journalism and better for the freedom of information to have all this technology at our disposal? Mark?
Well, look, I mean, it's a mixed bag, but it is what it is. I mean, I think that, I think to sort of think that somehow we would be better off or might be better off if there was less technology or different technology, I think is sort of fruitless because,
it's here.
And the fact is the media has always been, and journalists have always been in the position of having to respond to advances and changes in technology.
But, I mean, you think about in the old days, I grew up in a small town in New Hampshire, and if you wrote a letter to the editor about someone, you had to sign it.
Yes.
And it was there for the
anonymity
whole town to see.
Yeah, no, anonymity is, I mean, there are a couple of things that I think are, on the whole, bad, although there are some good. One is that it's a lot easier to hide, to sort of express an opinion or put a story out there, but without your signature on it. And I don't think that's a good thing. I mean, people hold us to task for not being transparent. I think anybody who's, publishing, should be standing behind whatever they're.
Unless it'll get you killed.
With exceptions for a place of repressive regimes.
Yeah, repressive regimes. That's right. There is a place for that. I mean, the other thing is just time, and because for a whole variety of reasons, just the amount of information, the speed at which it travels, the way in which we all have to sort of absorb so much information on different platforms. Ultimately, one thing that is finite is time. And a lot of good reporting just takes time. It takes the time to actually report the story, check the story. But as Bill was saying earlier, often behind that are years and sometimes decades of time that you've spent becoming an expert in something, developing sources, developing instincts, a gut for stories, whether things are right or wrong. The more we have this kind of intense competition for our time, I think the more all of that is put at jeopardy. So I think that's a downside, I think.
What's your sense, Norm, of the anonymous on the internet and the harm that can potentially cause?
I'm not, well, look, I think that most people trust named sources more than anonymous sources, although sometimes that's not the case. But anonymity per se is not a problem. I mean, going back to the Federalist Papers, anonymity has been a part of expression here. I think to me the mixed bag is much more an economic one. On the one hand, it's never been easier to report and write and publish individually. On the other hand, it's never been harder to get paid for it. And so, the very largest organizations like the New York Times remain committed to very strong, in-depth reporting, but the demise of coverage of state houses across the country is one manifestation of the ways in which, at this point at least, there's not become an electronic media response. And so long as all the ads go from newspapers to Google, that's going to be really hard for a lot of traditional media to do the kind of journalism that many people have always counted on in their communities.
Although it's only fair to point out that the death of newspapers began with the scourge of newspaper publishers shutting the evening paper, shutting the competing paper in a lot of towns. Long before the internet came along, the newspaper industry was committing kind of suicide.
Yeah. Besides, if the logical extent of what I said, of course, is that Google gets into the news business, and then we'll really be in trouble.
No comment on that one.
Yeah, well, indeed we would. I think we're going to, on that note, leave it there. Thanks so much. Terrific panel. Great discussion. Thank you very much, all of you.